Hi, over the last several days, I've received a number of questions about the demand analysis and priority posting plan. So, as I was going through and grading, I realized that there's still a little bit of unclarity around the whole issue of priority posting. So, I wanted to address that just briefly. And also, there's a couple other pieces of information I'd like to pass along. So I'd like to start by us taking a look here at demand analysis. So that's really the first place to start. If here you see a traditional demand analysis and you see many of the values we've talked about, such as the max, the average high, the average peak, the 90th percentile, which we said really is probably about the same as the average peak. Um, it really depends on your data and how much data you look at. But the concept with average, again, and average peak, and the average high, and the average peak was that in the 1980s, when system status management was first evolving, personal computers really didn't exist for use in analyzing demand data. So the decision was made we should look at a quick way of actually evaluating demand. So in that concept, the way it's calculated and the equations that you have are based on that traditional approach where we split the data up into various subgroups, and then we take, say for instance, the maximum value of each of those subgroups and derive a value. It's much easier in terms of calculations, it's less accurate, and really the need for that doesn't exist today, but it's still utilized by a lot of folks. So I wanted to share it with you. The 90th percent rate is a great calculation. It's a formula or a function that's built in automatically to Excel. You can do that very easily. Again, all of these traditional approaches don't include the concept of service time or distributions. And when I say distributions, I'm really talking about the concept of variation in demand. So if we say an average, really an average only equates to about 50% of the time what we expect. The other 50% of the time, or the way to think about it is 50% of the time we're going to have too few ambulances, 50% of the time we're going to have too many ambulances for a given time of day. So the average, kind of goes without saying, is a bad number to use in terms of forecasting and planning. Unfortunately, many people still utilize that. Or even worse, a worse example is I've seen some people actually utilize the mode, which is the most frequently occurring number. And in that example, if you have 2 calls on 3 days, and every other interval or every other time that you analyze, every other day, hour of the day that you analyze is different, and it could be all of them are higher. The mode's still 2, so you may plan for 2 when in actuality the average could be 10 and the 90th percent could be 18. So you have to be very careful about what you choose in terms of a value to utilize. So in terms of your assignments, you want to do the demand analysis, and you can do it again doing one of these simplified traditional approaches. And you make the decision which is appropriate for your system. Again, the average peak is about 90%. The 90th percentile, of course, is 90% of the traditional demand. And even though that's not as accurate as maybe QN analysis may be, it's a good place for you to start in terms of planning. So once you've done that, you're ready to move to the next step. The next step is to actually figure out how many ambulances you're going to have at a various time of the day. Well, for the examples, I said just assume one time period of the day. And in reality, in most systems, you take and you kind of group together a set of time frames. So for example, 12 o'clock at night to 8 o'clock in the morning may be one time frame that you look at. The way you determine that is you would do this analysis for each of those hours, just like we did in the demand exercise a couple weeks ago. You would do that for each of the 168 hours, and you would look for patterns. If there's similarity between hours, say between 12 and 8 o'clock, then it stands to reason that's a good way to plan. The other thing that comes into play quite often, and this is the piece that's missing in most systems, people have a tendency to say, well, we schedule people from for a 12-hour shift or a 24-hour shift. So because we do that, we have all these extra trucks. We may only need 4 ambulances to actually provide service in terms of our demand analysis in the middle of the night, but we may have 8 on duty simply because we schedule that way. That's really totally inappropriate. One of the key ways to optimize EMS systems in terms of efficiency and effectiveness and financially is to look at a better matching of supply and demand. So that's actually the first place to start. Unfortunately, most people don't want to start there. They want to start with trying to figure out where to place ambulances. That's not the place that you can optimize the system the most. That's not the correct intervention point. So the first place to start is to figure out how many you have. Now, it does stand to reason that if at 2 o'clock in the morning you need 6 ambulances, and say between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock you only need 4, well, it may be that you do end up with 6 on duty because you don't want to have crews come in at all kinds of weird hours. That does make some sense. You do have to take the human component into play, which in essence, when you look at your midterm exam, the final question is asking just that. It's asking you to go one step further and decide how many ambulances will come on at which time of the day. And what I shared with you kind of in a visual sense was that you can use a linear program to do that you can actually create in Excel. Very easy, somewhat simplistic to do. Or you can use something like Zoll's Zoll Rescue's what do they call it? Scheduler, I think is the name of the program, where it actually takes some of these things into consideration. And unfortunately, even as sophisticated as that is, it uses a traditional demand analysis instead of using queuing theory, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's the way it does it currently today. Hopefully they'll advance the product over time. Okay, so the first place to start is the demand analysis. And once you've done that, then you're ready to go to the next step. And the next step is actually to look at where you're going to actually place units. So the way that this works well to do, or a good way to approach this, I should say, is here you see a map. And in looking at this map, you can see the demand and kind of how it's laid out. So if we look at this, we see 2 hotspots. We see a hotspot, and let me see if I can make a circle here where you can see it a little better. We see a hotspot in this area, and we'll change the color of that to make it a little more apparent what we're talking about. Let's make it bright red. So here you can see a hotspot, and I'll move the circle, and here you see a second hotspot, right? You see the kind of lavender color. If I move that out of the way, you can look at these other areas, and you can see in the other areas high density, the yellow is low density, and the green is even lower density. So if I start out and let's say I only have 1 ambulance, then what I need to do is I need to determine where I'm going to place that ambulance. So with my map at hand, I would start, and I would probably want to put the ambulance somewhere in, let's see if I can bring something up here to write with, somewhere in this vicinity, right? So if I'm wanting to put the ambulance somewhere in this vicinity, we'll make that bright blue, or let's find a color here that stands out. Hopefully you can see that. If I'm wanting to put the ambulance in this location, then that would be a point that I may put an X and may say that's P1 or S1, so station 1 or post 1. Now, automatically you're thinking, well, that's not where my stations are. Absolutely. It's the concept of this location may move depending on the hour of the day. So that's why dynamic deployment is so beneficial in a system to be able to meet response time requirements, because a station is usually not the optimal place. So we would look and we would determine where that location is. Now in reality, you would look at this small subsection of the area. Let me zoom in a little more. And you would look in this area and you would determine exactly where, which street corner, which location that might be the best place for a post, and you would label that. Now in the exercise, you don't have to get that granular. You may just put an X there and say that's P1, post 1. Okay, so let's do that. Let's delete this. I'll get my text editor here and I'll put in P1. Okay, so here's P1. All right, kind of big, but we'll leave it big so that you can see it on the video well. Okay, so P1 is going to be here. Now that's one ambulance. Now let's assume that we have a second ambulance become available. When that second ambulance becomes available, there's two things you should think about. One, you should think about where it's coming available from. So for instance, if the hospital is in this area, then it could be that you just want to move P1, the truck at P1 down and leave this truck in this general vicinity. If the truck's way out here and the other side of the community, right up here, well then we may not want to move it down. You need to look at it and determine where's the best location for post 2. Now in this example, I would probably leave post 1 here, and I would create a post 2 somewhere in this vicinity. Okay, let me see if I can draw an arrow again for that. Somewhere in this vicinity, right? Because it can move down to cover this demand, if we have a demand point here at the second hotspot, or it can move up to cover demand in this area. Okay? But that's completely up to you to decide. Now, for your exercise, we don't have the granularity of the streets and exactly what's taking place. So what I'm trying to get out of the exercise is you to think about these concepts and think about where would I put that second ambulance. Okay, so then I put a second X. So this may become, say, P2. Not a 2. P2. Okay, so here's P2. And then I would do that. I would ask the same question for each scenario. Now, again, that's not truck 2. That's not the second available truck. That's a post. It could be that when a truck becomes available, that I have a really hot spot here at the bottom. So it could be that when I go from level 1 with 1 ambulance to level 2 with 2 ambulances, that I actually move a truck to P3. So I have a truck at P2 and a truck at P3. I move them to those locations. When you do this from a computer optimization modeling perspective, what's called a greedy model will actually reassign every single vehicle in the system, regardless of how many you have, and move them to the most optimal place. Now the problem is, in terms of implementation, you really put a lot of stress on the crews making them move that much, and you don't gain that much in terms of optimization of response. So you've got to balance that, and that's the balance between art and science of figuring this deployment analysis out. So what you get from that is we would have a number of posts on this. We could have more posts than we have number of vehicles, because as we move different trucks around, we may see we need to move 2 to different locations from one central location out. So you have a number of posts, any unlimited number. Some places, for example, this community may have 100 posts. You probably, for the example, don't need to go to that depth, but you may have a few more than the number of ambulances. The other thing you should do is you should actually plan about 2 levels above the number of ambulances you do have. The number of vehicles you plan on staffing at any given time. Because one of the things as you start fine-tuning the system, you may find that you need to add unit hours at a given time of the day because you're not meeting the response time requirements. And in doing that, you know exactly where they need to go. You already have that planned out as part of the overall deployment plan, instead of having to go back to the maps and pull them out and relook at that again. Now, the scenario could happen every 20 weeks, theoretically. Usually it doesn't happen that often that you need to move trucks that much in that period of time. And because you can look at it, the other thing you can do is you can look at it over a much longer period of time, and longer periods of demand will give you a good idea what's taking place, hopefully, unless the system's very dynamic and you've got a lot of new communities developing. It'll give you the data, the information you need to optimize these places a little bit. So for example, where one's here, one may move slightly over time. When we look at the long term, we figure out a better location. And as we better look at locations over time, as our plan evolves, right, iteration after iteration, or simulation, if we're using computer simulation after computer simulation, we better understand where those facilities or locations should be, and we can actually place facilities there. As I mentioned in one of the lectures, some places actually do this iterative approach, and they actually have facilities that they can pick up and move. They've moved to that concept so that they can actually have more dynamic capability in locating their facilities where they really need to be. Now, in most systems, that level of dynamic movement doesn't exist, not in a short period of time. So that's probably not something you need to do, you should expect to do on a monthly or every 20-week basis, being moving stations around. That's not going to happen. So over the long term, we can better make decisions about where we're going to place stations if we decide to use a decentralized station approach in our system, as opposed to one centralized book-own station like you saw in the facilities section a few days ago that the city of Toronto implemented. So that's the second step. First step was demand analysis. Second step is to identify posts where vehicles will actually go. And then the final step is the priority posting plan. So if we look at the priority posting plan, you can actually see an example of it here. And we start at level 1. If we only have one ambulance, where would it be? Now here you see an example where the trucks didn't move. Like I mentioned before, it could be that post 11 is the place where one ambulance is at. But when we go to level 2, it may be that it moves to posts, let's say, 14 and 18. So they actually move out from that central location. I just want you to give some thought to that and how that works. But what you need to do is you need to have, in this example, we'd need, our demand would require, at let's say a 90% rate, about 13 ambulances or 13 units at this period of the day. And again, let me just divert from this just for a second. When you think about number of units, you have to think about units in terms of transported patients. So when I talk about units, I'm talking about ambulances. If we have fly cars or quick response vehicles or QRVs, whatever we call them, to actually respond to stop the clock, that's fine. But they can't transport a patient. And because they can't transport a patient, they're not figured in as part of unit hour utilization. Those are resources that have no chance of recouping revenue for you. They are good resources, though, if you need to stop the clock and difficult to respond to areas until you can get an ambulance there, because they're less expensive. So there's definitely a trade-off there. They can't create revenue for the system, so they're not cost sustaining in and of themselves, but they can serve a purpose in a very limited sense in some systems. So you got to think about that. So let's assume in this system we need 13 ambulances. Of the 13 ambulances, we actually plan 2 levels higher, level 14 and 15. You can see the priority at the bottom and the level at the top in accord to the number of ambulances. So you see the highest priority post is post 11. The lowest priority post at the end of 15 is post 20. In the far right hand corner here of the table. And you see this is for the time frame of 2300 to 8 a.m. So 11 p.m. at night to 8 a.m. in the morning for this system, and the number of scheduled units and the coverage of that. We expect a 90% coverage at whatever our given response time requirement is. So that's the priority post. Now, the reason you want this instead of a bunch of maps or a bunch of long, complex documents is if I'm the communicator, I can look at this and I know if I have 4 ambulances, I need to have an ambulance at post 11, 18, 14, and 23. It's pretty quick to interpret. So easy to interpret, actually, that it could be that if you're in a system where, let's say, for instance, your county communications is not playing well in terms of your operational performance and your need, and you can't seem to remove that function to something that you do in and of yourself, which, by the way, again, communications is the most important function. If you have control over anything, that's the thing you really want the control over. But let's say you can't. You could actually take in smaller systems and create a pocket card such that the crews know, and I've done this and it worked fairly well, they know exactly where to go based on the number of units that are available, and they can kind of self-coordinate that, self-manage themselves to some extent. And I think it was pretty appeasing to the crews to actually be involved in that process because they felt like they were helping to manage the system and playing a bigger part in making sure the right thing was done. The other thing in this particular system, there was actually an improvement in response times. There was less movement of the crews between locations compared to historical standby plans that were in place. And they were involved in creation of the plan and managing the plan. So if you can add some of those components from the human interaction component or perspective, that actually is very valuable as well. So that's the 3 pieces. That's the flow. The demand analysis, then we determine all the posting locations, then we take and we determine from that, okay, how can we put that in a simple to use priority posting plan such as the one you see here. Okay, so now if there's specific questions about that, please post them on the Facebook thread. I think that would be a little easier that I can answer them for multiple people because several people did have questions about exactly how these pieces fit together. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to add in terms of this update is everyone's been working on their projects. Last week I actually posted something called Slideology. So I'd like for you, or maybe it was the slide doc, what Slideology, it was the slide doc link. I'd like for you to take a look at that. With your projects, the concept that I would like for you to focus on is that you're taking and you're trying to sell whatever the concept is to some governmental official, some executive oversight group, or your executives within the organization. So you're trying to sell this concept. So let me just take for an example. Just a few moments ago, I noticed that I received an email or a link on from the Facebook site that Caleb uploaded his evidence-based medicine project. So let's take his project. Haven't had a chance to read it yet. I just noticed that it was there a few minutes ago. But let's take that for example. So what Caleb would want to do is actually sell that concept that we should be doing evidence-based practice to the executive group. So not only what would you like to do and why should you do it, but the key piece that I said there to begin with is what you want to do. So in other words, you're selling an idea, you're selling a concept. I know what the literature says about evidence-based medicine. So it's not about telling me that, it's about you creating something that's a sale, if you will, to that senior group. Okay, so in the example with that paper, and again, I just saw it, so that's why it came to mind. Let's say he wants to sell the concept of doing evidence-based practice. So what does that mean? What does it mean? What would you like to do? And how could we do it? Why should we do it? What's the literature say? So it's much more than a traditional, I want it to be more to you, okay, than a traditional research paper that you would write to learn to write papers. It's not about that for me. For me, in terms of this course is about system design and operations. It's about you taking the lead in improving the system and doing things in a more innovative, state-of-the-art, cutting-edge, out-of-the-box sort of way. I know that's not traditional. I know that's not what you're usually asked to do by your professors, but that's what I would like for you to do for this course. So at this point, with where papers are at, I would ask that you take with the iterations, and in terms of the iterations, do two things. One is if you're thinking about executives, I can tell you now from 10 years of consulting experience, very few executives that I wrote traditional reports to read the reports. Okay? If you look at the literature from places like some of the big consulting firms such as McKinsey, Accenture, Boston Consulting Group, Ernst & Young, on and on, those groups, what they found is that things should be presented in a way that executives can get the concepts quickly. They see the detail. Okay, so there's a combination there. They see what it is in terms of a picture of what you want to do. So yes, I want you to write a report. I want you to write the research. I want you to have the references. But think about how you can do that in a way that's not requiring an executive to sit down and read a 30-page document that I can guarantee you they won't read. Very, very slim chance. So you've got to sell the idea. It's a total package. It's much more than a written paper. Now, in terms of the peer review backing, the other thing that that through my conversations with kind of everyone in terms of their projects is there's a little bit of misunderstanding about the literature to be included or involved in terms of references. In terms of the references, peer review references are the best for the fact that they're often research oriented. They are generated in a context that they have to be reviewed before they're published. But the other thing is about peer review resources that you'll find is that they're often very delayed. So sometimes a new concept will come out and it may be 2 years before it happens. So this is somewhat a mix of research and process improvement, which the concepts are very similar, except research, we worry about publications and academic tenure and et cetera, et cetera. Performance improvement, process improvement, quality, we worry about figuring out how to do things better, and we move in that direction, and it's quite often an iterative approach. So I want you to be open to using both types of literature. The literature I would suggest that you try to stay away from is the things that you'll find in trade journals. So if you take, for example, Journal of Emergency Medical Services, okay, you've had some papers. You'll have some more papers most likely in this class. There's some things, for example, system status management. The only literature that really exists currently, it'll be changed soon, but the only literature that currently exists in terms of system status management or dynamic deployment or deployment in general for EMS is in a trade journal. And that's very unfortunate because no one has really studied what the best model is or published it in the context of more academic form, such as a peer review article or a textbook. Now, textbooks are usually based on research for the most part. There's examples, especially in the clinical EMS literature, that's not the case. For many years, in terms of academic literature like basic trauma life support is a good example that always comes to mind. How to ventilate patients. There was absolutely no academic research to tell people to ventilate patients at 20 times a minute. And the unfortunate thing is that probably killed a tremendous number of patients because a patient with this very hypotensive has low cardiac output that you ventilate aggressively has a tendency to go into cardiac arrest because you actually decrease coronary perfusion more and it actually gets worse. So it's really a bad thing. So there was no scientific basis for what was taught to ventilate patients at 20 times a minute for a number of years. So you always want, if you use a textbook, to look at the literature and see where it came from. If somebody's basing it off of an opinion, it's not a good source to use out of a text. The same way with using opinions out of, industry journals such as GEMS or Emergency Medical Services or things off the internet such as EMS World. Those things are truly opinions. They're thoughts. They're just conjectures about that come out of the air. And unfortunately, there's no basis for those things. In terms of you looking to sell an idea, it's better to stay away from those things because I think what you'll find in the long term in your career is you'll find that you'll sell things based on some of those conjectures, and in the long term, it'll turn out that they don't turn out to be the truth, or they are completely, focusing in the wrong direction, or get you to do something that actually is not worthwhile. So be very, very careful about those. Okay, so one last thing, and I'll end this short update that I just felt like I needed to share with you. References. When it comes to references, there's actually a way that doesn't really, I think, require any software, any updates. It's actually, I know it's available in my Microsoft Word, and I imagine that's what most of you use. And even though I have a Mac, I utilize Microsoft Word simply because it's easier to interact with other people that use that. But let's say here's a document, okay? And I'll just type in some text, have the document here. Now, I want to put a reference. Now, again, most of your courses in the graduate school and health sciences will actually ask that you use the MLA format, I believe, for citations. And there's a couple different ways to do that. So I ask you to be consistent about your way in doing that. And I've posted a couple links on the website under the term paper tab that will elaborate a little more about doing that. Unfortunately, most of my work I do in APA, American Psychological Association format, which is different. But regardless of which one you do and which direction you end up going in terms of academia, I wanted to show you this shortcut. If you go, for example, again, this is the Mac version of Word. But if I look on my Mac version of Word, under the View tab and I come down, you actually see a tab that says Citations. If I click that, mine comes up with a new box. Now this will probably look a little different on your desktop because it's probably within this frame instead of free floating like this. But it'll come up. Now, let me move this to the center. And I don't think I can make it larger, but if you look at this, what you'll see is a citation style. I can actually choose which citation style between APA, Chicago, MLA, and one other. Now, if I do that and I come down to the bottom left, mine actually has a little plus sign that I can click, and it'll come up with a dialog box. And if I look at the dialog box, the top of the dialog box has the type of source. And I can choose whether it's a book, an article in a journal. I can choose if it's a report, a website, electronic source. So instead of you having to remember every single one of those pieces that should be done for a given type of source, right? This is a lot. This is a lot of sources for you to remember. And again, it's different between the styles. So instead of you trying to remember that, you choose whatever type source you have, and it basically asks you to fill in a box. Now, when you fill in the box, let's see, we'll just say this is, we'll say I'm the author for this. Okay. And I can fill in the title. We'll say it's actually a paper that I published years ago. And you just go down and you fill in each of the components. Now, I'm just going to go ahead at this point. I don't even remember the year. We'll put in, let's say, 1997, somewhere back in there. And we'll put in a month and I don't know, put in a day. Okay, so I can add these other pieces, right? These are probably not correct. I know these aren't. But then when I click OK, it actually adds that source. Now, every time I utilize that reference, it's already in place. So instead of me typing all that information, when I need to add a source, I can actually just say that I want to add the source like I did here, click on this, and it'll automatically put it in. Also, you can see if I change the format, right, it changes the format the way it should be in terms of your document. So a little trick that means a tremendous amount. Now, the one thing I'm not sure of, because I haven't used this version of Word on my Mac enough yet, but historically, when you put those in, you could actually have Word maintain all of those references. So when you read something, it actually was maintained over time. So it's not just that paper, but it was maintained in your reference list, that was your citation list, that your bibliography, if you will, or your works cited, that's there in Word. So if you write another paper and you utilize it again, it's still encoded in. If not, you should be able to go into the paper and copy the sources and move them over. You may have to work with it a little bit to do that, but I think it'll maintain those. It historically has maintained those in the references. So that's just a little trick in terms of citations. You don't have to type all of that stuff over and over and over. You don't have to worry about it not being in the correct format. And when you get ready to go to the end, you can actually go to your version of Word and figure out exactly where it's at. And you can actually tell it to insert auto text or a bibliography. And it'll actually put that at the end of the document. And you can rename it works cited or whichever format you're using, but you can actually have all of that posted at the end. The other thing you can do is use endnotes. Sometimes with MLA, people will use endnotes where the reference is actually on the page as opposed to all the stuff at the end. But what I ask for MLA, because I'm not that familiar with using MLA, if you're going to utilize MLA, which I would suggest that you do, by the way, just because your other courses are going to ask for that, and you won't have the confusion of different type sources. If you're going to do that, actually look at what they recommend in terms of that, what the latest recommendations are, because those things do change over time. So it's not a one-time venture that you learn it and it's that way, sometimes there's a little bit of change that takes place. So with that, I'll stop with this brief update that turned out to be about 40 minutes. Sorry about that. Didn't mean for it to be quite so long. But hopefully this helps some. And if you have questions, post them in the Facebook thread, and we'll try to answer them. Thanks. Have a good rest of the week.